Welcome to this module of Professor Messer's free CompTIA A+ certification training course on installing and configuring power supplies. I'm James Messer, and in this module we're going to learn about the requirements from our CompTIA A+ 22702, our practical application exam, section 1.1, where we need to install, configure, and maintain power supplies. It's kind of simple to think about, but it's one of the most critical things we need for our computer is to get power inside of it. So we're going to work on how you would actually get a new power supply installed or how you might replace a power supply that you already have. One thing to keep in mind, power is a very dangerous thing. You want to be sure if you're working at all with power inside of your computer that you're taking the proper precautions. You're unplugging from your power source whenever you're working inside of your computer, or even sometimes on the outside of your computer. Maybe you want to have your power completely unplugged from the wall to be very, very safe about what you're doing. If you're not sure about what you're doing or what you're touching or how you're working with this power, don't do it. Call somebody, have somebody familiar with the configuration, work on that. And the idea is that we're going to be working with entire power supply units as well. You are not going to be opening up a power supply unit and replacing a capacitor inside one of those. Power supply units are relatively inexpensive. We can throw them away and get a brand new one and make sure that we're not going to cause any problems. So at no time should you be opening up and repairing the internal components of a power supply. You should only be working with them as one single unit. So how would we install a power supply? Well, we know that if we're looking at the motherboard itself, we've got this big connector on it to be used for power. And this is what that connector looks like that's plugging into the motherboard. This connector is coming right off of our power supply. It's providing that motherboard with DC power. It's converting that AC power from our wall outlet, converting it to DC and putting it right into the motherboard using these particular cables. You'll also see coming off the power supply usually a lot of different kinds of connectors. There may be a 4-pin power connector, this Molex connector. There may be another type of connector for our SATA drives. We saw that in our SATA video. Floppy drives have a special kind of connector. If you have an older computer that still has a floppy drive on it, you may see these smaller connectors coming off of the power supply. Now, if you don't have something like a floppy drive inside of your system, you're just not going to plug this into anything. It'll sit loose inside of your computer. Don't cut it off. Don't disconnect it unless your power supply supports disconnecting it from the power supply itself. But most power supplies just have all of these different connectors coming out of the end of it. If you don't use them, just don't plug them into anything. They'll just sit very separately inside of your case and just not connect to anything. Here's the server case that I use. I've not even installed the motherboard at this point. We've got a power supply and a big open section on where this goes. And if you refer to the documentation of your motherboard, it will tell you exactly where the power supply is expected to go. If you're buying a power supply, you also need to look at the size of the power supply and make sure it matches the size that the motherboard is expecting. That's a pretty important part. You don't want to get a power supply that's too big. It's not going to fit in here along with the motherboard. Once we slide it into the right place, there are some screws on the sides of this that will connect the power supply right into the motherboard itself. So very simple to physically connect it in there. But now you've got all of these wires coming off the back of the power supply. That big connector for the motherboard is there, but then you've got a lot of others that are here as well. One thing to look at in this particular case, the last person who was working on it put this little piece on it that sticks to the case itself, and the idea is that you could use a zip tie to slip through here that would keep all of these wires in one place. So if you have that option, or maybe you have something that you can use to collect all these wires together, that may help the airflow inside of your computer, which is always a concern when working in these cases. Once we have these wires in place, we know the motherboard cable needs to plug in. In this case, the motherboard connector for the power is way on the other side. So we're going to plug it into this connection over here and make sure that it's going to connect through all those. It goes all the way to the other side, just plugs right in. We've got other cables for the power as well that are plugging in over here. You can see we've got connectors into drive arrays. We've got connectors into CD-ROM and DVD-ROM drives. I've got floppy drives in this system. So all of those other connectors are going to plug in and power the other peripherals that we have inside of this computer itself. If you want to double check how this power supply is running, grab your multimeter. You can look at the pin connections that are on the motherboard that you have for that power supply. Maybe you aren't even going to plug it into the motherboard yet. You just want to make sure that those pins are putting out the right amount of power. You can unplug it from the motherboard and slide your probe into the other side of it if you'd like to, and put one side on the ground and the other side on one of these pins and see if you're getting 3.3 volts on pin 1. See if you're getting 12 volts on pin 12 and 5 volts on pin 19. It's a great way to make sure that your power supply is providing the right type of power on each one of these rails and making sure that the power that's coming through is exactly what you should be expecting to come off of that power supply. You can see now that we have the multimeter in place, it's showing us 5.03 volts of power coming out of that 5-volt pin, so we know our power supply is working exactly as it should. Now we have another video that talks about how you would use this multimeter, where you would plug in, the things you need to be careful with when using a multimeter, especially around power. So if you're not comfortable with doing that, you may want to refer to that video to make sure that you're able to do this troubleshooting the right way. Let's see what we've learned about power supplies. Our first question is, what common 4-pin power connector is used on legacy components? Well, I had a picture of one of those. That's that big 4-pin connector that we tend to call a Molex connector. You may also refer to it as a 4-pin connector, since Molex is really the name of a company that makes many different kinds of components. Next question is, what is the size of the power supply based on? Well, we saw in our case that we only had a little bit of room available inside of that case. So we need to look at what the motherboard is going to require with the components that we're plugging in. We should also look to make sure that it's going to fit in the case that we're using. So there's a couple of things we need to look for when determining what size of power supply, not just in wattage, but also in physical size that we're going to need. And the last question is, where can you find the pinout information for your power supply? Well, the best place to go is to the documentation for the power supply. You may also want to refer to your motherboard documentation and make sure that the information on the motherboard and what it is expecting with the power pinouts really matches exactly what your power supply is going to provide. Well, that covers the information that we needed to know for our 22702 section 1.1, where we needed to know all about installing our power supplies. We have free A+ videos for the entire A+ course. There's message boards and much more if you visit our website at freeaplus.com.